So I think what I want to do is try to say something a little differently, and really to reflect additional thoughts I've had about the collective work that we are setting out to do. I also think that part of my contribution to this work is really mobilizing essentially a bully pulpit. It's not the, or even perhaps the biggest one, but it certainly is one, and hopefully one among many, to what has been defined by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences as a crisis in the humanities, with a report issued last year called The Heart of the Matter. I assume some of you, all of you may know of it, some of you may have read it closely, but I think being mindful of what we are all here gathered to focus on and to figure out how to chart a meaningful and constructive path forward, we do have to make the most of the kinds of both evidence in a very general sense and shared communities of allies who are thinking through what does it mean in a nation that, as they define, is not only educating its children poorly, less effectively training its teachers in the humanities, and for them this amounts to a threat to our national security. Now that's sort of government speak. I'm not sure I think we see similar crises. I'm not sure we would couch it in militaristic terms. But to the point of whether or not we can claim a productive citizenry that is inclusive and that has equity built into the framework of our society, I think for me that kind of security really is about cultural security and economic security rather than, say, national security. And I focused on this at a recent talk that I gave at the University of Puerto Rico, really to sort of, no, I'm sorry, at the Ransom Center at the University of Texas. I can't keep up with where I've run my mouth recently. And I guess I just wanted to, for those who haven't read the report, throw out a few things that the report cites. And first, they talk about the declining federal investment has declined by roughly 50% in the humanities. Now, the humanities, by comparison to STEM fields, were always less important to federal funding. But the high water mark was roughly 30% in recent years, has now fallen to 20%, which effectively amounts to a 50% cut in the amount of money the federal government is giving to support general research in the humanities, which is inclusive, I see, of the work that we are engaged in. The other point is that when you compare that to how universities divvy up their allocations for general support of research, the humanities have a much larger slice, which is declining. So universities have essentially carried the weight of the humanities, given that the federal government has never been a major funder of the humanities. But in both cases, the numbers are declining substantially. Why I think this matters is not just that this doesn't necessarily tell us something new, and of course I'm not a big fan of couching, as many of you know, our problems in straight statistical terms. It does give us the kind of talking point that I think we need to be able to say with the imprimatur of the Academy of the Arts and Sciences, we have a problem, and what are we going to do about it? And for them, the issue stretches across the academic communities, but they try to balance a kind of critique of the focus on STEM with a call for action in the humanities. So they don't see this as a zero-sum game, but they do worry aloud in the report about what it means to construct a society that no longer values imagination, that no longer values a kind of appreciation for the soft squishiness that represents the humanities itself. Even the ways in which, as we are all witness to as adults, so much of the soft capital of success, the individual human capital that people bring to their successful careers, generally turns at a certain point in your career on your facility with cultural heritage, with your awareness of, call it world civ, call it American history, however you want to define it. We all know at a certain level that it's those kinds of skills and fluency that really do shape the professional trajectories of people beyond a certain level. So one could argue that maybe STEM becomes a kind of Trojan horse for a new vocational class of employees who will not have that cultural capital if they don't have the arts. And that for the elite, for the privileged, the arts remain core and central to how they educate their own children outside of our public education systems. I think we have to be willing to at least offer research projects that give meat to these such claims. So here I am essentially offering hypotheses that I think people around this table can explore in their own various ways. But I think that STEM has essentially become one angle on a kind of new vocational army. Now it looks better than the vocational army of the past, but Ainsley, for example, Erickson from Teachers College participated in a conversation at the Schomburg a couple of weeks ago as part of our conversation series, and I can't remember if it was Ainsley. I think it was Ainsley's work in Nashville, Tennessee, where even in the 1970s, I believe is the period she was covering, there were gradations of vocational work. And so the black students were stuck in woodshop and basic mechanics, and the white students in Nashville were learning aeronautical engineering. They were working literally on airplanes. And so I think the bar has risen for what counts as technical knowledge and training today, whether it's coding or building microchips. But at a certain level, there remains still a glass ceiling beyond what it means to have even those basic skills. So I think part of the ruse in the STEM area is that we imagine all of these kids running to Microsoft for high-tech jobs, which are really now the new woodshop mechanical jobs. And that the layer that moves them from those positions of leadership as we imagine them today to the top remain in this soft humanistic space where people know how to talk, walk the walk, and really move and be engaged in large worldly matters. There is, and this is this great point that I had to land on, and I've been holding it right there. It's been right there for like 250 words, and now it's gone. It has to do with the morning. Good thing I'm not in front of a lot of people right now. So, oh, yes, here it is. So one of the things, and this is really a call to sort of think through these things. So we know there is an Asian American achievement gap, or I should say a white achievement gap by comparison to Asian American counterparts. We also know that Asian American and Asian immigrants are held as exemplars of a kind of commitment to STEM fields. We know that, sort of in the rhetoric of national security, it is BRIC nations, and particularly India, that is leading the way in producing the world's engineers, and they're continuing to come, and Americans are crying foul because they think to themselves, we must, educate our own to do this work. Yet, all the evidence of leadership in our country suggests that for all of that technical know-how that our South Asian engineers bring to the table, they're not running our companies. They're not sitting on the boards of directors across America. They are not the leadership class. So I want to put that in conversation with the work around historical literacy, because I think that's something new to my thinking about this, in the ways in which it calls us to be more critical of exactly what STEM means to the children I think that we are particularly concerned about, particularly poor children, particularly children of African heritage or Latino heritage in this country who remain in our public school systems, the ones who are building on intergenerational disadvantage and continue to be fodder for political debates about what they should be doing. So when someone like Newt Gingrich says as a presidential candidate in 2012 that black children in Harlem don't see examples of people working hard, not only does this defy the actual reality of working people and how much harder they actually work to make ends meet, but that they should be janitors in their own schools as a means of learning a kind of commitment to a work ethic That is sort of the raw political discourse of the far right, but somehow I think it squares a lot more neatly than we'd like to imagine with the kind of commitment to STEM. So when someone like Mitch Daniels is becoming a booster for STEM, we should have concern. We should caution, because again, I think the intellectual elite and the political elite of our society fully recognize that privilege and wealth are articulated and expressed in this country through the humanities. I mean, if I go to another cocktail party or gala or benefit and somebody asks me something about some obscure artist that I've never heard of, I'm going to vomit. But that's precisely the world in which people are not engaged. And precisely coming back to the crisis of historical literacy, coming back to the crisis that the Heart of the Matter identifies, I think, puts the humanities really at the forefront of a larger battle over inequality in our country. So again, I am really talking through these things because I didn't, want to give you something that is more polished for me, because these are new thoughts to me. There are other examples here in this address that I gave at the Ransom Center, mostly drawing from things that are extant in the media, talking about Stanford's imbalance between the number of faculty in humanities versus the number of majors. Harvard's experienced 20% declines. So we also have a consumer demand problem. And the consumer demand problem to me also is about the K through 12 pipeline. So if the teachers aren't prepared to defend the right to teach humanities, if they are not willing to fight for arts education and robust historical literacy and cultural literacy in the classroom, then you're also looking at students who are coming out of our public schools in particular, who are only imagining success as defined by engineering degrees, business degrees, professional degrees. And that consumer side of it then reinforces the policy setting agendas of state legislatures and presidents of universities that say the students don't want to take these classes. They can see that there are no jobs in these areas. So, 20 years ago when I was a student, places like Goldman Sachs was deliberately recruiting people with English majors and history majors because they knew, one, that those kids were smart, and smart people can learn anything, and two, that they would have the ability to think about what they were doing in a bigger context, which ultimately would be down to the benefit of the company, rather than everyone being an automaton with a very narrow, specialized focus on, intuiting financial derivatives. So something shifted, and I'm not sure the Goldman Sachs shifted in its ability to recruit, but I wouldn't be surprised if even there's been an erosion of an appreciation at the hiring level of what it actually takes to produce people who think deeply and critically about the world.
I wanted to add a couple of things. First of all, that was fantastic, even for 20 minutes, holding that idea out there. But there's something I want to come back to that I think is really important, and I think it's going to go a little bit to what you were talking about. And you use this term cultural fluency, which I think is so important in this notion of my niece is in college and she lives with me. I raised her, whatever, and she's like, I have to have a major where I can get a job. And I said, but I want you to study what you love, because what people want and the job that you're going to get is for people who are smart and who can think. So there's this ability to move between the technical, right, all of your mathematics knowledge, but also your ability to interact. I don't know any obscure artists either. I barely know the ones that are well known. But there's this notion of kind of like the cocktail party talk that you need to be able to do. And there has to be some sort of way to emphasize the importance of being able to move through a whole bunch of different areas and have fluency in all of them, because it gives you even greater capital in a whole bunch of ways. So it's really like what you're saying about, you're going to benefit from public speaking, but there's this idea of somehow changing the focus from being vocational with a small v in the sense of working your way towards a career, because we could make the argument that law school is vocational as well. You take this set of courses and you come out and this is how you're going to practice law. But this idea of the importance of thinking, to bring back, and I know I'm totally out of time, in saying, to bring back in a sense the life of the mind, the importance of that, and to be able to show examples. And I think the greatest example, and fits in with what you were saying, is Bill Bennett's new book about how liberal arts education will do nothing for you, and yet he was a philosophy major at Williams and got a PhD in philosophy and got a law degree from the University of Texas and became a secretary, in, I forget whose cabinet he was in, and yet a liberal arts education will do nothing for you. So I'm looking at this from more of this higher ed perspective of bringing people back into the liberal arts and in a sense, for lack of a better way to put it, sort of funneling people into liberal arts colleges as opposed to technical colleges, or the notion that any major that you take is actually going to get you a job, because even if you get an engineering major, you're still going to have to get a master's degree, you're still going to have to go through some sort of training, whatever kind of engineering it is. If you get a degree in accounting, you're still going to have to take more tests and do more exams. And so there's this idea of bringing it back to an emphasis on the ability to think, right? To be able to reason, to think, to break it down beyond discipline, to really think about those kind of skills that you need. And I don't mean, we all use this in all of our curriculum, the notion of critical thinking. Beyond that, how important it is to be able to think, to understand, to reason, and to be able to make those choices. But I really like this idea, and I'd like to come back to it a bunch of times, Betty, in terms of this idea of cultural fluency, because I think that's something that people can understand, is the ability to move in and out of different environments, right?
Not only do I agree with you, Callie, I think it's interesting. I think we all remember E.D. Hirsch and the backlash against cultural literacy. Right. Mm-hmm. But there was a point there when Khalil was talking, and you crystallized it for me as well, where as important as that is, in this new conversation about STEM, which Khalil, I think, was masterful in talking about that as kind of the new wood shop, is that you're pushing kids toward these jobs. But there's still something to be said for education's function as fashioning young people who are able to function in a participatory democracy. And I think part of what gets lost in the way that we think about historical literacy is making the case, as you were saying, where we say, in essence, look, it ties into what some people were talking about earlier in terms of community involvement. In order for us to create or reimagine communities in which young people have a vested interest in the community and a stake in the community, what do they need to do, or what do they need to take in order to be a functioning part of this community? Well, one would imagine that they might need 12 credits of accounting. Depending on what neighborhood they live in, they may need some foreign language. So the idea that we can cut out language, which is happening on a lot of college campuses, right, is a problem if you live in the Bronx. You need foreign language. But you also need history, because there's something about the communities in which you live. There's something about knowing what Marcus Garvey Park represents that helps to make you connected to that community. And I think part of our selling point is that, and I hate even using the language selling point, but I think it speaks to Khalil, is part of the idea is that if we're going to reimagine the humanities in a space that makes a case for funding in conjunction with STEM and everything else, it also has to be this case that says, not even aspiring for jobs, but just back to this notion that in a participatory democracy, these are the things that you need to know in order to be able to be a functioning member of the community, unless we're abandoning that totally. And I think that's part of our conversation is reimagining the ways that we do that.
So I wanted to come back in, because there are some parts of my thinking that underlie what I just described, and I think it's important to put them back in the conversation. Because I think, one, first of all, STEM is terrific for people who actually are inspired to go on to be engineers. I think it's not a one-size-fits-all. And to me, that's where the workshop question comes into play, which is to say, if we are actively pigeonholing our children into careers in STEM, we are essentially cutting off parts of some of those kids who are never going to find themselves in that. And so in the ways in which their sense of themselves and their confidence matters to their educational success, then we have to give them as much as we can at the earliest pot. We can't. So then that raises a question: why is it that we are choosing to dispense with liberal education as the basis for more specialized educations? Because we have a resource problem. So the same world that produces No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top is a world predicated on the notion that maybe we can't afford to educate everybody equally. Now, that's not what they're going to tell you, but when you have an education system that is promoting reform on the basis of grants, essentially you're saying we're going to make tough choices here, and we're going to reward the schools that seem to be doing better than the ones that others, and the other ones have to get their act together, rather than a notion that a fundamental right to a quality education across the board. So the resource question, I think this group has to also think deeply about: how do you put that in the conversation where you make more visible the fact that school is expensive, that there's tremendous inequality with how resources are dispensed around the quality of education, and that at the highest conceptual levels, STEM essentially guarantees that there'll be a better match with the workforce and the job opportunities, which is essentially contrary to liberal arts education, right? It's not utilitarian. It is, by definition, intended for a person to find themselves across a menu of educational offerings. And again, to me, it is always very difficult to look beyond the ways in which our independent and private schools educate children. I just always want to caution educators, don't let them off the hook. Because until they have shifted all their resources and says, you know what, we're shutting down the library, who needs that? Everyone has a computer, and everyone's going to be doing STEM from now on, or at least that's where we're going to put our focus, then I suggest that why are we being faced with those limited choices? Also, this notion of the politics of knowledge. So we are in a particular moment made more visible by the election of Barack Obama that, again, can't be left aside. That part of the politics of knowledge is that liberal arts education has produced, in the wake of the 1960s, a bunch of red diaper babies who are critics of capitalism, who believe in all sorts of dangerous, permissive values in American society, which, cut against family values. I mean, you know the story. But that's real. And so in these state legislatures, whether it's Arizona, whether it's Texas, or whether it trickles down into the classroom, where recently in Queens, some teacher told a kid, you can't write about Malcolm X for Black History Month because he was a bad guy. That's a commentary on the school, on the teacher, on the larger construct of the politics of knowledge that are playing out across this country. And so there's something about history in particular, as a subset of cultural fluency, that is threatening to the status quo. It's why you have someone like Rick Santorum refer to college as for snobs, or why there's a sustained critique in parts of the country that college is really just a liberal indoctrination. Even if you take that at face value, liberal indoctrination may be the only guarantee we have that in the absence of the exigencies of a capitalist market that will propel many people into the market-based economy to perpetuate the market base, that you at least have people who have conflicted, right? And I'll finish with this point on my own journey. So, none of this for me exists outside of me. So I grew up working in a small business. I wasn't reading Adam Smith, but I most certainly was sort of on the path to wanting to be a business person. Happened to be a computer store, so I was totally enamored by computers. I sold them, I built them. But college not only exposed me to a set of questions that turned out to be more interesting to me as a person, but also that was the first time really I encountered an attack on my culture and my humanity from outsiders for the first time in my life in a sustained way. And I stumbled as a result of it. I mean, it caught me off guard. And so a world where Bill Bennett is telling us that we don't need liberal arts education, or where Newt Gingrich is saying kids need to be janitors, or where Arizona legislatures are saying Mexican-American kids don't need to learn their history, is also, to my mind, very clearly an attack on the ability of those kids to challenge the world as it is, to challenge a world that says, your history is less important, your heroes are bad people, and you should stay in your place. And, again, that's not the kind of analysis that's going to pass in a lot of company right now. But I challenge folks to push back enough to say, well, is he right or is he wrong? But that's, I think those kinds of dots have to be made for historical literacy. I'll finally end, and this is something I didn't say last time I was here. Not for nothing, COINTELPRO wasn't just about an attack on black militants or those who were outwardly critical of the state, but also about grassroots activists who were teaching black history to kids. Mm-hmm. And there was those places that, so you can read O'Reilly's Secret Matters, which is the most thorough look at COINTELPRO today, that in FBI's own internal memos are documenting bookstores, sites of cultural literacy and training. So, one memo says that we have sent agents to cover all the places in Harlem that are promoting African culture. So this notion that, Eurocentrism is the invisible white privilege of cultural heritage, that anything that counters that, which we, I think, all recognize as essential to our kids, and that by that I mean the kids we teach, no matter what their backgrounds are, is essential to them having a sense of positive self-conception of themselves and to see themselves in the world, was completely obliterated in a coordinated attack by the federal government that took place 40 years ago. And who knows what echoes continued, because I'm not a researcher of those files. I'll stop there. At the risk of, again, seeming too impractical, I wonder if the frame is inequality. So, to put at the heart of the statement that history education has proven time and time again to be a source of civic engagement to improve the quality of life for all Americans who suffer from tremendous inequality. So essentially taking the indisputable fact that America is in a moment of historical inequality. I mean, we'd have to go back to the 19th century to reproduce levels of inequality today. And then the question is, so if we can agree, right, because there are those, call them plutocrats, if you like, who would disagree. But I think in terms of the constituencies necessary to support something like this, you're not going to get that much pushback. It's not going to be too politically charged to say that this work is about the problem of inequality. And what is the relationship between that problem and historical literacy, of cultural understandings, essentially political, how do we claim to be a country whose greatest gift is democracy, predicated on opportunity, that finds itself at a moment of tremendous inequality? How did that happen? And one of the responses to that is that a citizenry disengaged from his own history didn't know what to fight and defend.
Can you say that again?
No, I can't actually.
A citizenry disengaged
from its own history didn't know what to fight and defend. So that we trade on, and here again, I'm going to retreat back to the trees for me because these examples are so prominent in my mind, but you'll all have to hold constant that big idea about inequality. But to me, so you could use labor movement as a classic example. So at some point, the labor movement in the context of the Reagan era became the worst thing that ever happened to America. No surprise we are where we are, right? Or that the notion that a renewed labor movement, a la Bill de Blasio and his $7 billion arrears to the current public workers of New York City is partly a consequence of a set of tax decisions over the last 30 years where we said we want wealthy people to keep more of their money. And we don't have enough to fix our roads or keep the salt piles sufficient, or to educate our kids, or if we're going to try educational reform, we're going to cheat by sticking charter schools in buildings where they don't pay. I mean, you know, you could name all the ways in which we have accommodated a set of tax policies that are at root the cause of that inequality. Now, the difference is that the corporations will say, here I'm back in the trees, but bear with me for a minute, because I think this is all history informing the analysis, right? Mm-hmm. So you could say that, well, globalization created an economic incentive for American manufacturers to seek cheaper labor. But that does not, by definition, mean that those same corporations have to pay their CEOs or their management classes as much money as they do. Mm-hmm. So you could still literally export. Now that causes a problem, but the problem of taxing those companies creates a different problem, right? You're compounding two problems. So in my fantasy world of, you know, sitting at the table and the President of the United States says, so all right, Khalil, you've got all the answers, what's it going to be? And I say, issue an ultimatum to every company in America, right? So you question of what is an American. And you say, if you want to be an American company, if you want to go to bed at night saying, I'm a good American, then you have to pay your people more. And guess what? You can't run to the nearest state because it's a race to the bottom for every state, as Cuomo is now engaging in Rick Perry type policies of, you know, no taxes for the next 10 years. New York State is welcome, you know, welcome for business. Or this notion that the minimum wage is the increase is gonna lose jobs. Well, say, okay, that's a hiccup, right? But a new baseline means that when you work, you have a quality of life. So all of these questions trade on notions that we've wrestled with for a long time. And the simple fact is that if we really want to wrestle with inequality, if we could imagine a critical mass of Americans rallying around inequality in the context of historical education, then we would at least better understand how we got in this mess, and we would have some sense of how to get out of it. Because letting Boeing shop between Seattle or Illinois or Utah, you know, for the lowest dollar because the employees have demanded too much, is a consequence of a set of decisions at the top that said that those companies need to keep as much money because that's their right, or that the companies need to buy into the political system. I mean, so again, those are all symptoms of the problem, and we're all familiar with them. But each one of them, you know, so freedom of contract under Brandeis in 1905 was a lesson learned about the implicit power that corporations have over individuals. So individuals don't, by definition, are not equal parties to employment contract because they have to work, right, to eat. But a Republican vision of America, or a vision of America today, is predicated on universal employment, not because everybody actually has a job that actually can pay you, but on a world without minimum wages, you're literally looking at starvation or anything that somebody will pay you, which is better than nothing, which is essentially the model of the third world or developing countries, because for every dollar more, every marginal dollar they make more above the dollar they didn't make 10 years ago improves their quality of life. But again, you can only see these things. I mean, you don't have to have a PhD in American history to see them for what they are, but that's the danger, I think, to the plutocrats. The danger to the plutocrats is that we don't want people walking around making all these connections, and then instead of like, we're going to give you your taxes back to the folks in Kansas, who are like, you can keep my taxes as long as we have great schools, as long as I have a decent job and I don't have potholes that I'm running over every day. All right, I'm done. But inequality as a framework, as a universalizing problem that is infinitely diagnosable, right, in the language and the evidence that we all have access to, and then to ask the question, can history help us to understand inequality better and to help our children that we teach have a better sense of what it means to be an American, which I would submit doesn't mean being a plutocrat, which is essentially what we are teaching our kids to be.
I have to say this because not only was that amazing, but it also makes the point. We think about this in terms of New York and teaching here. So Khalil's given us this great breakdown of how this has played out, and his frame of reference for all of us in the city of New York who teach New York school children is Lochner versus New York, the case that challenged the notion of liberty to contract. Now, if I don't have the freedom as a teacher because of Common Core or whatever, to be able to engage my students in a larger question about what it means to be an American, core democratic values and liberty to contract challenged in this city, because this city literally, and this would be true of Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, any urban center. In fact, I would submit any community, but your urban centers in particular. You can teach all of American history through the landscape of the history of that community. And Khalil just did it for us very powerfully in the city of New York. So there's all these ways that we can bring all these things together. But it's making the case that we have to reimagine to a certain degree what historical literacy means and the process of redefining what an American is and what it is that we hope to teach or communicate about what the core of American values are. The National Council for the Social Studies, going back to your point, Jenny, which was a really good one, has these core democratic values for elementary students. And they're culled from the Declaration of Independence and the preamble. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. If those are our core conversations about fairness, and we teach history around those things, then we are meeting both the conservative demands of, well, when we say what it means to be American, it means, ticking these certain boxes about knowledge of these documents, but also the demand of folks who are saying, but we want to live up to what those things say, not simply know what they mean, but actually live up to the values that they impart. And I think it was really powerful to see you do that in that context, and for us to maybe think around a model of historical literacy that would demand fairness and equality, be engaged with these larger civic questions, but also force people to think about the ways in which their own communities have been the battleground of this fight for fairness and justice across time.
There are a couple of pieces in here, I think, Betty, that are really important. Not just talking about history education, but talking about what civic engagement means. Because it's a limited type of civic engagement. I think how many of us here are talking about civic engagement is really more about sort of fomenting revolution in some way, right? As opposed to the notion of civic engagement, you should vote unless you get a letter telling you that you can't vote. You should know what the 3 branches of government are. You should participate in your community by recycling and throwing out garbage and, all like that level of civic engagement, as opposed to what you have on here, this idea, you say, what is an American? And I think of it more as, since it's such a loaded term, more of like, what does it mean again, coming back to the idea of citizenship as opposed to civic engagement. I think that that's the problem, is in the research that I'm doing, as disheartening as it may be, it seems that there was always, we know this, there's one education for one group of people and another education for another group of people. And so it's much easier to take this broad, if we go all the way back to the 1840s and the Common School, the beginning of public education, it was about muting cultural differences and teaching a common American identity. That was its purpose. So it wasn't about necessarily participating, it was about teaching you what you need to know to not cause any trouble, in a sense, right? To be a good and passive citizen, to vote, that's your notion of civic engagement, for lack of a better way to put it, right? So when we talk about that idea, I think what's happening at the table is it's not just about historical literacy or illiteracy, it's about understanding what civic engagement is as we begin to tie it to history. How are we understanding that? And there's something else that I wanted to say to follow up on what Jenny was talking about, and I said this to her, is, there's this notion that history is static, right? That it's just a dried up set of facts and that it has no action, that it isn't dynamic in any way. But there's also a way in which you teach history that it's very human, or as I call it in my class, the Us Magazine version of history. Talking about George Washington marrying Martha because she was incredibly wealthy and they only met 2 times. I'm sorry if I'm destroying anybody's notions of what happened at the foundation of the country. So, there are those pieces of it, but, in talking about this as well, some of it has to do with the way in which we educate our teachers. I hate to keep muddying the problem or making it more and more difficult, so I guess out of this, this is why you shouldn't give me free rein to talk, is this notion of understanding what we mean by civic engagement, how we're understanding it in this think tank, but how it's being promoted in a curriculum is one piece. And then, and I wrote this down, what is the role not only of teachers, but also of teacher educators, right? In making history a dynamic discipline and a necessary foundation, right? It can't just all be the responsibility of teachers who are given a state curriculum, you know, and these are the things that need to be met, and these are the things that are going to be on this exam, but also how do teacher educators work with teachers, in a sense, to change the stigma of history, but also to teach in a way that makes it dynamic, that it's not, you know, the one paragraph assigned to Reconstruction. I taught in California, so when you said 3 days on Reconstruction, I was like, we taught the colonial history up until 1850 when California was founded in 3 weeks. So Reconstruction was, the Civil War was a paragraph, and Reconstruction was a paragraph all in one day. So so I'm just saying there's a way in which we can't just leave the responsibility to teachers all alone, but also a way in which we're educating teachers of history. Actually, I guess of all of the disciplines, right? Of all of the fields. And it goes back to what you're saying, your conversations with the nursing professor. That's the same kind of conversation that needs to be had, and that's the great thing about having Luciana here, is it's like, well, I work in a bunch of different fields, but my content area is really about the importance of history just as a baseline, right? So I'll stop there, but I do want to come back to this idea of what we mean by civic engagement, if that's how history is being promoted. And in a sense, that's what this grant, you know, is saying. Well, it says a bunch of things, but we'll go with that one.